Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Guido Gluschke, Ben Hiller, Chelsea Slack, Immanuel Malisevich, and the moderator, Richard Harknett.
My job as a moderator.
You got the hardest job.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. So I peer out at a wonderful crowd here at 10:15 on a Saturday morning, and I was reminded of in the U.S. space exploration, famous line, you may have seen it in the movie of Apollo 13, right, where the commander sort of matter-of-factly reports back to Mission Command, Houston, we have a problem. So if this many people are showing up on a Saturday morning to listen to a talk about cybersecurity, I think it's fair to say that we've recognized that Vienna, we have a problem. Either you folks are way too dedicated, right? Or cybersecurity has actually reached the stage of consciousness, right? That we recognize it as a area of strategic behavior, and sort of building off a little bit of what Roger Robertson said yesterday at one point talking about economic sanctions. He said, what's that space between words and war? Well, I would suggest to you that cyber-enabled strategic behavior, right, is filling that space. And what we have assembled for you this morning is a terrific panel of experts, both from European security institutional perspectives, from industry, which is absolutely critical to have at the table, and then from a research institute standpoint. The students have done a wonderful job of putting together a program, and so we all agreed that we wouldn't waste your time by reiterating their terrific bios, so we'll encourage you to go ahead and look at those in the printed catalog and just get into our discussion this morning. My job as moderator is to make sure that we leave a significant amount of time to reward you for getting up so early to talk about cybersecurity and get you to interact with our panel. And so what we did agree to is we're going to go through a 5-minute shotgun round, if you will, to first address the question from each one of our panelists' perspective. What's the most significant cybersecurity challenge that they see out there for Europe, both institutionally and at the state level? And then I have a follow-on question to them from their own in particular perspectives, right? So we'll ask Ben to talk about OSCE, Chelsea to talk about it from a NATO perspective, Nino from the corporate Microsoft perspective, and then Guido to give us an academic research institute perspective on that. I don't know what they're going to tell us, right? But hopefully it'll be a little bit of an range. And that's part of the issue that we face with cyber, is just defining the problem. So as Sanjay pointed out to us, right, we can talk about this field from a very technical standpoint, from a behavioral user standpoint, and from a strategic policy standpoint. We're not going to get comprehensive security until we bring all of those pieces together, and I couldn't agree more with our speaker earlier. And Roger gave us this perspective of these are not just one-off hacks, right? And I think we've gotten into that kind of metaphor a bit too much. But this is strategic behavior, and if it's strategic behavior in part of multiple actors, we have to think about it more as a campaign, right? So there are objectives, and there's now a capacity and a space in which to pursue those aims. So how do we start to anticipate how state and non-state actors are going to be exploiting advantage in this space. So with that said, I'm going to start off by asking Ben to start us off with, from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge out there, and how is OSCE handling that challenge, or positioning itself to handle that challenge? Right. And I'm going to keep them to 5. So we'll see how well I do with that.
You can try.
We'll try. Let's try.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and to introduce some of my perspectives, or the OSCE perspectives, on the biggest cyber challenges that we are facing in Europe. And I think the simple answer to that, from my perspective, is the use of information and communication technologies by states or state-sponsored groups. And here particularly the threat of such usage of spiraling out of control because of too many unknowns. It is somewhat disconcerting to hear from a technical guy, Sanjay, that the attribution problem has still not been solved. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. There is some growing consensus among experts that recent high-profile cyber attacks, which had a significant impact and also were widely publicized, are likely to have had some sort of involvement by a state. They were just simply too sophisticated for your average cyber criminal or terrorist. Though a lot of the time the media does try to portray that there could be some organized criminal entity behind it, I believe on a personal level, and I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary, as much as you can talk about evidence when it comes to cyber, that there is no state component ever involved or some link. So the use of ICTs by states is a reality. And this also occurs against the backdrop of states heavily investing in cyber capabilities, both offensive and defense capabilities, and as we heard as well, have elevated cyberspace to the 5th domain when it comes to warfare. And I'm sure our NATO colleague can maybe talk a bit about this in a second. And to give you a much quoted statistic from the UNIDIR, United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, already in 2013, 10 out of the 15 biggest military spenders possessed or are developing cyber capabilities. So this is happening. States have recognized that if you want to have a strategic advantage, you need to invest in these capabilities. And they are, compared to other capabilities, fairly cheap. So you don't have to be a superpower to have some capabilities. And as OSCE participating states know all too well, cyber capabilities have also been used in the OSCE area and also in recent conflicts. So they are being used and deployed. And my biggest worry in this context is that the use of ICTs can fuel or even escalate into conflicts, intentionally or worse, unintentionally, because there are too many unknowns and we're attributing cyber activity erroneously to another actor or state, potentially because we have had difficult relations with that state in the past. So it's very easy to blame that state without maybe the full picture. And so I believe that we could very easily find ourselves in a situation where cyber activities have been attributed erroneously and a new conflict layer cracks open that is very hard to control and manage for any institution or international organization. And not because we have full clarity, but because there was a default reaction to a potential adversary in the heat of hostilities. And I believe that scenario is not too far-fetched, especially if critical infrastructure is involved in this scenario. And we're seeing more and more attacks, sophisticated cyber attacks on those installations. And given the importance of critical infrastructure to national security, it is probably more likely that tensions flare up between states over a cyber incident involving critical infrastructure than any other activity. And of course, the consequences would be very destructive, hugely divisive, and affect citizens across borders. So this is the threat scenario I'm building up because you asked us to do that. Mm-hmm. So what's the OSCE doing? And I do apologize to my fellow panelists because I am quite biased when it comes to the OSCE, and I think we achieved quite a lot when it comes to that. and especially in the field of reducing the risk of conflict stemming from the use of ICTs by states. And what participating states have done quite successfully is to develop a series of confidence-building measures over the last, since 2013, which are designed to increase transparency, cooperation, stability between states and their activities in cyberspace. And this really is as much as we can do at the moment, given that the attribution challenge has not been sorted out. So what the CBMs do is they allow states to read another's posturing in cyberspace a bit better, making cyberspace more predictable. So in a way, if something happens, you have better tools at your disposal to make a judgment call, to say, okay, this is out of character or in character of another state, so if we are suspecting another state. So this is a cluster of CBMs that are focusing very much on posturing and transparency. Other CBMs focus on actually laying down concrete communication channels to address potential tensions through the use of ICTs. What happened before is, because of the attribution challenge, it was very easy for a state to say, well, it wasn't us and you can't prove it. By agreeing to engage in structured dialogue, if such an incident happens, through a permanent council decision, it's much harder for states to not engage with each other. So in a way, we're applying the concept of peer pressure in this context, because we have such difficulties of proving things beyond reasonable doubt. But we can force states to come to the negotiation table and say, okay, before you react, you sit down and sort it out. And this is how we're going to do this. So again, we created tools that can be employed before things escalate out of control. And the third cluster of CBMs focuses on being what we call good cyber neighbors. You cannot create confidence if you don't believe that other states that you are dependent on when it comes to your own national cybersecurity do not have the tools and mechanisms in place to protect themselves, because they can cascading effects on yourself as well. So the CBMs are very much focused on states doing the homework and sharing this homework with other states to say, look, we are a positive partner in this. We're doing our homework, we're doing this to protect us, but also yourself. So again, that creates confidence, trust, and transparency. What is unique about them? I'm coming to the end. The OSCE is the only international body that achieved major accomplishments between states in the cyber field, between what we traditionally termed Eastern and Western state. There's no other agreement on a practical level with practical measures between these states that we have at the moment. So this is a huge achievement. And we were only able to do that because we have this wealth of knowledge and experience when it comes to confidence building measures in the traditional sense. So we could take that expertise and apply it to the 21st century. Why do I believe this is so important? Because we can say with some confidence, and this is what Sanjay also said, that the use of ICTs by states will only grow. This is not going to become less. We are going to see more investments, and states will make use of it just because maybe I'm a realist. And that's why I believe the work, not only of the OSCE, but also other international organizations is so important, such as the UN. I mean, the UN, as you know, is currently working hard on clarifying how international law of armed conflict applies to this new space. And Sanjay mentioned the UN group of governmental experts. They're also developing norms of responsible state behavior. Mm-hmm. And this is all vital. But the simple truth is there are enough regimes out there which prove, in terms of legal sense, that they exist, but they're broken every day. So what you still will need, even if we have clarity in what is accepted and what's not, you need the practical channels, tools, and communication lines that will allow you to apply this sort of framework. Because otherwise, what happens if these laws and norms get broken and they're not being adhered to? Well, you still need the practical measures to bring states together, and this is where the OSCE comes in. So I'm totally biased, as you can see, right. But I do believe, and I'm convinced that this is a unique field the OSCE has contributed a lot to. And I believe what is significant is that we really see interest by all participating states, from Russia to the US to the EU, all the way to Mongolia, in making this a success. And this cannot be said about many initiatives.
Well, since you are the subject of our conference. We'll grant that, and we'll come back to that as we go forward. Right. This whole notion of uncertainty and transparency. Right. Absolutely critical. Chelsea, from your perspective over at NATO.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Richard. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. Thanks very much to the organizers for the kind invitation. We were asked by the moderator, what is the most significant cybersecurity challenge European countries and institutions are facing? For me, I think the primary challenge is not often the technology, but it's getting the policies right and actually implementing them. We're often confronted by uneven perceptions of a very abstract and technical issue, which means our policy responses can be reactive and are often fragmented. Looking at the landscape, I mean, over 3 billion people online at the moment, that's only supposed to grow. The Internet of Things, as we heard Sanjay talking about, we're really seeing an intermixing of these physical and virtual worlds. And in parallel, we're trying to catch up in policy terms, addressing fundamental questions such as responsibility, governance, accountability. So what is NATO's response to this challenge? Well, our armed forces and our militaries, we're not immune to cyber risks, and we rely on communications and information systems to carry out our missions and operations. Much like in the civilian world, the military too relies on these important systems. And increasingly, we have been seeing state actors, non-state actors using cyber attacks to achieve diplomatic and military objectives. Attacks are becoming more common, more sophisticated. They have the potential to shut down infrastructure or impact operations. Now, NATO's greatest responsibility is to protect its citizens, including from cyber attacks. And that means that we have to be just as effective in cyberspace as we are in the other domains of air, land, and sea. The cyber defense forms an important part of NATO's strategic reality, and we have been enhancing and adapting our policies to ensure we take this technological and strategic reality into account. I'd like to highlight a few aspects about what we've been up to recently. First, it's important to recall that the fundamental mandate of NATO in cyber defense is the responsibility of its own networks. So our mandate is defensive, and we focus on enhancing resilience. In 2014, heads of state and government adopted the enhanced NATO policy on cyber defense. And what was critical is that we recognize that cyber attacks can be just as harmful to our modern-day societies as a conventional attack, which means that cyber defense is part of NATO's core task of collective defense. Also critical is that we recognize that international law applies in cyberspace. Since then, we've been working hard to bolster the protection of our own networks, and we've also been helping allies to strengthen their cyber defenses. Let me give you a few examples. We've extended the protection of our networks, which covers more than 50 sites, so from the US all the way over to Afghanistan. We've improved our ability to detect and analyze threats. We have a team of over 200 experts working around the clock. And we've invested in training, in education, and exercises to help make sure that our skills keep pace with technology. A recent example, our annual flagship cyber defense organization, Cyber Coalition, brought together over 700 cyber defenders from allies as well as from partner countries and, importantly, industry, highlighting the collaborative approach to cybersecurity and cyber defense. Most recently, in 2016, we did recognize cyberspace as a domain of operations, in which NATO must defend itself as effectively as it does in the air, on land, and at sea. And NATO allies have also been doing their part to ensure that they're equipped for and meet the requirements tailored to the 21st century. At the Warsaw Summit back in July, heads of state and government made a cyber defense pledge to strengthen their national cyber defenses as a matter of priority. And finally, NATO places a very high value in cultivating partnerships on cyber defense. That's with other countries, with international organizations, as well as with industry and academia. Our approach is very much a tailored one based on mutual interests, shared values, and common approaches to cyber defense. It's a team sport, and this collaborative nature means that we're stronger when we act together. So this leads me nicely to the last question, as how does NATO factor in leveraging the work of the OSCE in addressing this challenge? Well, NATO itself, we're not a norm-setting organization, but we welcome the process of ensuring a more transparent and stable cyberspace. Now, the work of the OSCE has been eloquently lined out, helps to promote open dialogue and facilitate shared understandings of this very complex issue, including through the development of confidence-building measures, which do just that. The Alliance therefore welcomes and supports the work undertaken in other international fora, such as the OSCE or the UN Group of Governmental Experts, on developing these confidence-building measures and voluntary norms of responsible state behavior. Because ultimately, I think we all stand to benefit from a norms-based, predictable, and secure global cyberspace. Thank you.
Chelsea, thank you so much. You add this layer of policy complexity to the conversation that we're going to pick up. And one of the elements of that complexity, right, is that it's not just the state actors in this space that have significant effect and capacity, right, but the private sector is actually a driver of much of the development of the terrain, if you will, in which all of this activity is taking place. So, Nino, why don't you give us a little bit of perspective from the private sector side of things?
Sure. Thank you. So, in my personal opinion, the most significant cybersecurity challenge not only European, but all countries and institutions face is the loss of escalation control stemming from a cyber attack by a nation state on another state. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Increasing numbers of nation states, and I'm very much aligned with what Ben has previously said here, increasing numbers of nation states are developing both their offensive and their defensive capabilities. They're doing so in line with their respective geopolitical and historic contexts. And different countries will reach different conclusions as to whether or to what an extent they should be focusing on developing offensive or defensive cyber capabilities. And this has created and continues to create a certain insecurity among states. And I would argue that this is not in the interest of international peace and stability. And if you wanted to use a more sensationalist expression, you would not be wrong in stating that today nation states are engaged in a cyber arms race. Consider against this background that more and more countries are developing strategies and policies where they clearly state that they may, in the event of a sufficiently serious cyber attack, respond not only with a cyber attack or with cyber weapons, but with real-world weaponry as well. Consider also that various groups of states, including military alliances, as we've just heard, are also looking into these questions and are developing their playbooks. An added complication is, as we have also heard, that reliable attribution of cyber attacks remains a struggle, and take all of this together, and I think you have a really challenging situation in front of you. So what's the private sector's response? I believe, or essentially it's what can and should be done, and I believe that we should focus on two policy areas. Number one, developing and implementing cybersecurity-related norms and CBMs that clearly outline responsible nation-state and industry behavior in cyberspace. And number two, creating an independent entity to help deal with the attribution challenge. So first, let me speak about norms and CBMs. Norms of responsible state and industry behavior in cyberspace are essential in ensuring peace and stability, and by extension, innovation and economic prosperity. And this is why my colleagues and I have developed and are promoting two sets of norms, one aimed at nation states and the other at the global IT industry. And I'll be happy to go into more detail here during the Q&A. How do we leverage the OSCE in addressing this challenge? Okay, full disclosure here. Before joining Microsoft in 2013, I spent 11 plus years at the OSCE. I was Ben's predecessor as cybersecurity officer. And in that capacity negotiated the first set of cyber ICT security-related confidence-building measures. I don't know if this still makes me necessarily biased, but in the interest of transparency, I thought I'll put it out there, because I do believe that the OSCE has done and continues to do excellent work in bringing states together that do not necessarily see eye to eye on a lot of issues. And it has managed to build and further expand on the first set of agreed-upon CBMs, and I think this is a tremendous achievement, and I would like to congratulate Ben and all the people that worked on this for the great work that has happened last year in this regard. The OSCE's work in terms of developing and implementing CBMs is an essential prerequisite for driving the broader discussion on developing global cybersecurity norms. And my only recommendation going forward would be, I mean, this will also not surprise anybody who was recently at the OSCE's conference on cybersecurity just the other week. My only recommendation would be to increase public-private partnership within the relevant body of the OSCE as these things are being discussed. So what about attribution? And Sanjay also very eloquently spoke about this, and I agree with the points that he's raised. Because ultimately, without progress in terms of attribution, it will become increasingly difficult to progress the development, implementation, and operationalization of cyber ICT security-related norms and CBMs. In the long run, I think this is very important, in the long run, the impact of norms and CBMs depends on whether they are implemented faithfully and whether violators are held accountable. Verification of compliance is key. So what should be done? And I realize there is no simple answer to this problem, but there are examples from the non-cyber ICT security world which provide potentially workable models, including, for example, the International Atomic Energy Agency or the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. We believe that there could be a similar organization or mechanism by which governments and the private sector can provide evidence to support technical attribution and obtain some level of validation through rigorous peer review. At its core, this organization would consist of technical experts from across governments, the private sector, academia, and civil society with the capabilities to examine tactics, techniques, and procedures used by nation-state attackers, as well as indicators of compromise that suggest that an attack was by a nation-state. And its essential output would be a technical analysis of the attack and evidence of attribution. And in some cases, based on agreed-upon criteria, it might also publish its findings. I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts on this, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You know, an important assumption that you threw out in this analysis, right, is in political science, international relations, we talk about the security dilemma, right, and that in realms in which there's either ambiguity over offense-defense advantage, right, that in and of itself, that uncertainty, right, drives state behavior in this dilemma, that every move that I make for security actually makes everybody else in the system feel less secure, right? But if I don't, then I'm not actually taking care of my own security. So we'll pick up on that, I think, in conversation, because one of these solution sets of this public-private partnership is of critical importance, and we'll get some depth about that. And so as we contribute to sort of allaying some of this, dealing with some of this uncertainty and leveraging the multiple players, one of the other contributing assets that we have is research on the in the academic side of the world in the research institute setting. And so from your perspective, Guido, what troubles you at night in cyberspace, and how do we manage that in terms of leveraging some of the institutional supports that we have out there already?
Thanks a lot, Richard. So, first of all, does it work?
No.
No.
No? Now, you know, we couldn't have a cyber talk without a technical glitch, right? I mean, and we didn't set this up. Nobody's hacking into this system, but we'll make sure. Can you try it now?
So probably is there a microphone?
Yeah,
Is that good? Yeah. You're good.
you're good.
It works?
Yep.
Thanks a lot. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the DASICON organizers for inviting me and hosting this event here. So coming to my experience, which comes more from the critical infrastructure protection area, so from energy, and in the last couple of years, I worked with operators and international organizations and nation states, so with all actors in this field, which gives me a different perspective than only looking from the policy area. From my perspective, one of the big challenges are, have we understood the threats correctly? So, or are we able to understand the threats? Do we have a good picture on the threats? That is one of the challenges. The next one is, are we able to detect these threats, the cyber threats, and are we able to give a proportional response to that? And the third thought is, what is an adequate protection against this kind of threat? And do we have the right capabilities and capacities to respond and to work in this field? That are more or less different views, different challenges. But at the end, when I thought about the comment of General Feichtinger yesterday, he talked about a security architecture. So are these different questions, or is it one challenge at all? Because if I do not know what my threats are, and if I'm not able to categorize them, to classify them, then I am most likely not able to detect them, and I'm most likely not able to give a response to that, or finding adequate measures to that. And that is not only a question or a view from the operator side, as I'm working very often with operators in the nuclear field, but also in the grids, and that are very sensitive fields, of course. So the question is, how deals the nation state with that view? So that are exactly the same questions. Even nation state has to understand what the threats are coming from, how to respond to this. And my feeling today is that neither the operator nor nation state has a clear understanding on what's going on here. We are very much working with old views. We are working with perceptions perceptions which leads to ad hoc actions or to probably reasonable predictions, which are not based on models or on things we all agreed on, or on methodologies which are there, that are very often actions based on personal views, as always in security. Most security actors are driven by their views on threats, on actions. So from a research perspective, I think there's a lot of work to do to classify threats and to answer the question, who is in charge of a response to what type of threat? In the physical world, in terrorism, it's clear. So if there's a terrorism event, usually it's responsible of a state. But how to deal with that in terms of cyber? So if you have attack to a nuclear facility, how can I, as an operator, from operator's perspective, classify this attack as a terrorist attack or a script kiddie or a nation state's attack? There is no way to do that for me as an operator, from operator's perspective. And it's even difficult for a nation state to do that. Probably impossible. Yeah? And I think that is one of the, from my perspective, one of the big issues. We have to find a way and have to work together to make this perception more visible, or the threats more visible, which leads to the perceptions. Because what we all know is that from our perceptions, actions and decisions are going out, and money was spent to things, looking to the German attack in Christmas time. That was a small attack in terms of the harm which was done, but a lot of actions are coming from that attack. So the question is, how is this related to cyber? We have a couple of cyber attacks not visible. So how to make this kind of attacks visible? What are proportional reactions on this? And how to deal with between nation state and operator in the sense. So in the nuclear field, we have a mechanism and methodology on how to deal with any kind of threats. So there's a methodology which is used in most nation states, where the nation states talks with the operator about the threats they are both seeing, and they agree on what to do. But that is only in that field, or I only saw it in that field, but I'm not seeing this, for example, in the grid area, and the grids are very important, of course, for Europe. So if there is an attack at one of these 30 countries which are part of this European grid, that could lead to a blackout in whole Europe, and that leads me to the discussion of what is necessary to find the right solution for protection and for cyber defense in this area. And it leads to the question, who is responsible for protecting such a grid? Who's responsible? It couldn't be the European Union because there are countries which are not within the European Union. So how to regulate this? How to deal with this issue? And another question came up, and when I worked with the European Commission last year as one of 15 members of an expert group on cyber and energy sector, and what I learned from that was, on the one hand, that most experts in this group are not willing to talk about the military element, to include a military view. I think I was the only one who brought in the term cyber defense, because they all said, no, defense, that's not our work. We are working on regulations, this kind of things, but defense is not an element. But in terms of cyber, I'm convinced that we need all kinds of responses, and that goes from diplomatic response, over nation states response, homeland security, whatever, up to military response. I think nothing could be excluded at that point of discussion, at that point of understanding the threat or our lack of detecting and understanding the things. I think we have to discuss in a multi-stakeholder approach what are the right ways to defend or to protect this kind of infrastructure, and how to work together in this field. And I think every organization, NATO, OC, has its field there. And I'm very much in favor to discuss with all these organizations, with these international organizations, what is their place in the whole game, what they can do effectively to come to a solution for the whole energy or for the whole critical infrastructure section. So I will leave it with that, Richard.
Excellent. Well, I think, Guido, you just gave us a little bit more clarity of our uncertainty.
Yeah.
Right? So if we can't even classify what we're seeing, then we have difficulty about who actually responds to it,
exactly.
right? So, the classic case right now in the United States was the hack of the Sony productions, right? And you had some American officials getting out there saying, this is a criminal act, and so therefore the U.S. FBI, Department of Justice, should look at it. And then you had members of Congress going to the floor saying this is an act of war, right? And therefore the Defense Department should look at it. And then you had the President of the United States going on television saying it's cyber vandalism. And I'm still not sure what cyber vandalism is and who takes care of that, right? Yeah. But this gets to these authority issues. Right?
Yeah, but let me add some thought on that. It's not only on having understood that there are different players in the game, but also how to access these players. Yeah? So I personally can call Chelsea or Ben, but that are not the right persons for my problem if I'm now in a nuclear facility or a smart grid or a grid facility and say I need help.
That's right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
And then
don't have these
the
clear
whole
lines,
diplomatic areas, diplomatic ways came into policy areas, and if it's not clear on a nation state's level who is now responsible in terms of what kind of event, then we are losing a lot of time in reacting and responding.
Absolutely. So I'm going to put us on a clock for about 20 minutes of a rapid round interaction, and then turn our attention to the audience. I think one of the themes that I would draw out on this, right, is that we have from the detection level of ambiguity, right, all the way up to the reaction. Ben, let's start with the thesis that both you and Nino threw out, that one of the problems with this uncertainty is its effect on escalation, right? So before we get to so one might actually think about exploiting the fact that we're not sure who should be responding, right? Is that one element that we have to think of? Because we spend a long time thinking about escalation sort of in the Cold War and the nuclear kind of context, right? But in a large measure, it was a lot simpler, right? If we put a B-52 over the continent of the United States, that was signaling one thing. If we move it over the Pacific, that was signaling something else. And if it was flying straight to Moscow, they kind of knew what that meant, right? We don't have those kind of clear signals. So is that part of what you're getting at in terms of, your concerns about, I wrote down erroneous escalation or third-party manipulation of escalatory dynamics. Let's draw out a little bit on that.
Absolutely. This is exactly one of the biggest challenges, as you said. I mean, the inability to attribute a cyber activity, and we're talking about a cyber activity of significance. I mean, we're not talking about your average cybercrime credit card fraud. I mean, we are dealing with the use of ICTs by states that could lead to an escalation and a worsening of international relations. And absolutely, the problem is that we are building a regime, if you want, based on unknowns. And that is very different to what happened, I guess, in the Cold War era, where verification was very much part of any regime to de-escalate. So we have to deal with unknowns. The way we are tackling this is through proactivity. And this is what I said, allowing states to posture, drawing their red lines. And this is what they do all the time. I mean, the US says, for instance, this is as far as you can go, and if we go further, we're going to retaliate. Now, whether they will or not is, again, another decision-making process. Mm-hmm. But in a way, it gives other partners and non-partners more clarity what is acceptable to the state and what is not. But you need to proactively communicate that. And I think the CBMs, one of the cluster of CBMs are focusing exactly on that, communicating your red lines, how you're going to behave, what you see as a threat, and through that you give states a much better ability to react in instances. For instance, if there is a cyber attack on critical infrastructure, and you kind of have a fairly good idea that it comes from a certain country. Now, in terms of what you do next will be very much dependent on what information you do have, not only in relation to this situation, this specific incident, but also in terms of what you know about this country in terms of their posturing, mm-hmm. their red lines, their capabilities, their capacities, how proactive they have been in terms of communication with you. So in a way, it gives you the information, the CBM process, to make a more informed choice of reaction so it doesn't escalate. We are much more likely to engage with the country proactively if we have been in communication and transparency measure building. So you will probably not retaliate. You probably say, okay, you know what, we're going to give them the benefit of doubt, let's sit down. And how they can do it is now through these dedicated channels. There's actually a mechanism now in place that allows you to do that in a very constructive and structured way.
So let me draw on that, because we've talked a little bit about this CBM, right? And so we want to get to, norms are a convergence of expectation, yeah. Right? We have these rare moments where we can create them. Bretton Woods, for example, right? We're not in a Bretton Woods moment in cyberspace, right? We're going to have to construct these behaviorally through CBM. So, you suggested that from the private sector standpoint, right, that this CBM approach to behaviorally, right, getting us to clarity about what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, what can we anticipate. Can you give a little bit more of that perspective on that?
Sure. Just to briefly add to something that Ben had previously said, and again, I think the big concern really is that when you have a state attacking another state, causing a damage on a significant scale. Again, we're not talking about defaced websites here. We're right. talking about really bad stuff happening. More and more countries are putting it in their playbooks that they might respond with real-world responses. And I think that is just something that we have to accept and understand. That is the world we're living in. That is the tendency where things are going. And again, perhaps, Chelsea will speak about this from how NATO as a military alliance, is looking at these thresholds. Ben was mentioning red lines that countries are drawing. And you could have a discussion about how useful it is to communicate these or how exactly do you communicate these red lines. Again, this is a complicated discussion, but I think the fundamental problem remains is, how will countries react to a cyber attack? What weaponry will they use, or what countermeasures will they use? And how, do you keep control of the escalatory cycle that's gonna come from that? So I think that is, you asked Guido earlier, what keeps him up at night.
Yeah.
I sleep very well, but in general, that if I was staying up, that would keep me up. In terms of norms, I'll start this slightly differently. About a little while ago, when I had just changed to the private sector, a representative of a country, I'm not going to say which one, was very critical of the fact that Microsoft, or a private sector company, was developing a set of norms for countries, not just for industry, but for countries. And what that person said to me was, my ministry is not writing code. Your Microsoft colleagues shouldn't be developing norms. Now, she was very alone with that view. The support from states has generally been very good. And the reason here is states and industry are not alone in this sphere. They're in this together. I'm going to beat the dead horse of public-private partnerships a little bit more, because that really is the only way to go. And the way to look at this, you would ask, what kind of norms are we talking about? We're talking about norms such as, states should exercise restraint in developing cyber weapons and ensure that they are, developed, that when they are developed, that they are limited, precise, and ideally not reusable, just, as an example. And on the other hand, when you look at what should an IT company do, global IT companies should collaborate to proactively defend against nation-state attacks and remediate against the impact of those attacks. So what we have is a set of 6 norms each that prescribe certain things for industry, certain things for the private sector that actually complement each other really well. And we've seen several of these ideas reflected in subsequent UNGGE norm proposals. Ours came earlier, so I'm just throwing that out there. But again, the important thing is to keep this conversation going. It's a theme that Ben keeps also reiterating, that there is a type of responsible state behavior in this sphere. There is a type of responsible industry, global IT industry behavior in this sphere. And how do we make sure that these, that we're on the same page here to avoid escalation?
So one of the things, when you look at the bios, right, you'll find in Nino's title, right, is that he works for the security, strategy, and global diplomacy team at Microsoft. So Microsoft is in the business of diplomacy, right, in cyber. And I mean, this is critical important, right? I mean, I don't think that's this notion that industry has to be a player, right, in all of this. We can talk. I'm going to come back to the dead horse of partnership in a little bit, because in that space, if I could, Guido, pick up on your point, the absence, right, of this clarity, right? Let's just use the grid example about authorities. Where do we need to go with that? So we have some confidence-building measures with regard to escalation issues and moving us towards norms. But at the nitty-gritty level, if I pick up the phone, if it's still working, and I want to call somebody, how do we resolve that at a pan-European level?
So I would be happy if this works on a national level.
Okay,
yeah,
do it
first.
at a national level, yeah.
Yeah, but also on a European level or an international level. So the problem I'm seeing there is the trust between nation state and operators, yeah, and private industry. So we mentioned PPP, but that is mostly understood as there is a contract or a working relationship between those both. I would go further. I would say we have to integrate private companies or critical infrastructures in the security architecture or regime of the nation state. And that is not done properly, actually, because it is still seen as there are 2 parts of a coin. And a question of secrecy is, of course, one of the big issues on that. And that comes also from my feeling that nation states are not really sure on what cybersecurity means for them in terms of a military element in their strategy. Yeah? So countries are not sure about can we publish information on cyber attacks? Is this helpful, or is this exactly showing our weaknesses? So there's no clear. I think there's a lot of work to do to come to a situation that a nation state can handle this kind of situation or attack surface in a way that it brings an advantage for this nation state and also for our other nation states. And so what we discussed at the European Commission level was exactly vice versa. So from that perspective, we raised the question is, what do we have to do from a European perspective, or European Union perspective, on how to regulate these things? Yeah? What do we want to let these nation states do, or how to regulate these issues, especially for publishing incidents or making them disclose incidents, this kind of things. So could we learn from that, or should this be a secret community of companies? Should this be organized regional, or should this be organized at nation states level? That are all discussions, and there is not one answer to that, because we don't have experience with that, especially coming to the word regional. So from the European Union perspective, regional is probably the northern part of Europe or eastern part of Europe. If you work with IEA, for example, regional, this mean completely different things, like Africa is a region, Europe is a region. So even we are using the same words for different meanings when talking to each other in this layers, in this different fora. And so I would say probably we don't, I'm not sure if a security architecture is the right word, but probably a security regime which goes over the countries which are relevant for this particular purpose. If the purpose is energy, then we should have a look to all countries involved in this area relevant for that, and how to deal with that. And do we want to have a centralized, organized security, or distributed security? But then you have to organize it in a way how it works. And for me, the existing structures are not good enough, not timely enough, not fast enough in responding. And we have moving targets, of course. So that touches also legislation from my perspective. So by today, you would say there is a Microsoft is blamed for being part of a botnet. In the future, it's not Microsoft. That probably somebody is blaming you for your house is attacking a critical infrastructure, because you have smart grids, you have refrigerators, you have baby phones. They are attacking a critical infrastructure. Yeah, and that comes completely to different views on what is the legislation on that. Does it work any longer? Yeah, because you have not a person behind a malicious act. Now you have a house behind a malicious act. And that are all questions which have to be clarified, to discussed, and put into a picture or into a regime, how to handle that.
So we have this complexity at the national level. Obviously, you have to work this at the coalitional level, right? So as you layer that, and this is part of what the policy complexity that you were talking about. So I want to pick up on one thing that was just said about just the critical element of information sharing, right? And so how is NATO, from a primarily probably a collective defense standpoint, but sort of just managing different levels of capacity across its membership, and trying to achieve that initial goal of your own system security, right? But how do you empower differential capacity across the membership in just simple areas like information sharing?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And yes, I mean, part of my job every day is we have 28 members, soon to be 29 in this alliance, and we have to form one coherent policy, which we have on a number of occasions. I think, going back to what I was alluding to at the beginning, policies evolve and policies must adapt. And I mean, if you look at NATO the past few years, we've adapted our policies continuously to make sure that they're fit for purpose, precisely because of the varied landscape of perceptions and capabilities and moving forward. Information sharing. In a sense, I mean, the Alliance is a platform of allies. We share best practices. One of the strengths is the fact that we can bring all that we have to bear together and learn from each other and have better situational awareness because we represent these 28, soon to be 29 perspectives. Information sharing. we have a number of agreements, well, with all of the cyber defense authorities in each ally with NATO that facilitates through a dedicated point of contact information sharing. This is crucial because, as we said, who do you talk to? Do you just call up NATO, or do I call up an agency or an organization in country X? So really, we've worked very hard in the last few years to get points of contact, to get the policies and procedures right to facilitate this information exchange. So that's between allies very much. I'd also mention we've done a lot with partners. Recently, in 2014, we launched the NATO Industry Cyber Partnership, precisely recognizing that as industry owns the majority of this infrastructure, we really need to work more closely with them from a situational awareness perspective, but also so that we can be better defended. It's a two-way street. So very much looking at industry and academia and the way that we share information in real time with them. And last but not least, we talk about European security architectures. The European Union, a little bit less than a little bit more than a year ago, we signed a landmark technical arrangement with the European Union between our incident capabilities, so the NATO computer incident response capability, our CERT, if you like, and the CERT for the European Union institutions, which is crucial because, once again, it's direct points of contact, pick up the phone, share information in real time, and obviously benefit from the perspectives of the two organizations and their member states. So all in all, I think one of the strengths of NATO is that we do provide this platform for better situational awareness and information sharing. And in the past years, we've really tried to cultivate the partnerships we have with industry, academia, and other international organizations. I'd also end, because Ben is here, that, as I said, we do support the work in the OSCE, the UNGGE, and we benefited from a number of briefings from, including the chairman of the informal working group, who came to brief NATO on the efforts to achieve these CBMs, as well as for members of the UNGGE. So in addition, we don't set norms, we're trying to keep an eye and to follow and support what's going on in the broader international community.
Terrific. So before we hand it right over to our audience, I suggested that I'd give each of you just 2 minutes, although you don't have to take them. If there was something that this is just too big a subject matter, right? But if you want to plant a flag, even in the minds of our audience as they think about some questions, anything that we haven't put on the table yet that we need to have some thought about, and let's do it in reverse order. So, Guido, right? Yeah.
Okay. So my thought is actually looking from my perspective that we should encourage OSCE on working on the issues I raised here. And so helping to understand threats, helping to categorize the things, helping nation states to be better prepared in terms of cyber readiness. I think that would help a lot, especially in the discussions between nation states and industry. We should do some more work in this area. Yeah? So coming more from a model perspective, from a methodology perspective, and giving the nation states helpful information on how to deal with their industries, with their assets within the nation states, and how to, and probably giving vice versa the industry access to the panels supporting multi-stakeholder approaches in this sense. So being more active between both parties.
Terrific. Nino.
I'll just beat that dead horse a little bit more. Again, public-private partnership. Everybody loves public-private partnerships when they talk about it, when they promote it, when we're sitting at dinners or at receptions or when there's a press conference. But then when it comes to actually implementing them in a sustainable, effective, and meaningful way, in many ways, this is still where it proves very, very difficult. So again, I think this is something where there are examples where it's working very well, like what you just also mentioned. And again, there are cases where this is going well, but I think there's a whole lot of other conversations where we can, on both sides, do better. And I think this is just something that we should strive to do. As for the CBMs, I'm repeating the offer that we would be ready to support those discussions from a private sector perspective. And I'll leave it at that.
Chelsea.
Well, I wanted to leave you with one of my favorite quotes about cyberspace. It was from an article in The Economist a few years back, and in a rather Monty Python-esque fashion, it reads, "Aside from email, Skype, Facebook, iPads, iPhones, drains, water, electricity, and air traffic control, what has cyberspace ever done for us?" And I think it's fitting. I mean, not only does it capture, we've been talking about Internet of Things and our growing reliance and interdependence on it, this very tangible space that affects each and every one of us, but then the corresponding policy challenge of trying to keep this space a benefit for all. And as I said, for NATO in this era of unparalleled connectivity, both NATO as an organization and allies, we've been taking measures to try to adapt to this dynamic and complex environment. We want to make sure that the alliance is ready and resilient for a wired world. And we don't have all the answers, which is why it requires collaboration, mentioned in other international organizations, industry, academia. And we must work together, too, to engage in this cyber diplomacy. As I said, NATO's message is very clear. We all stand to benefit from norms-based, predictable, and secure global cyberspace. And finally, perhaps I'd just like to note how fitting it is that we're here at the Diplomatic Academy in Vienna, particularly as we observe the growing nexus between cybersecurity and foreign and security policy. And so, in my view, from students to practitioners, all the way up to the boardroom, we really need to cultivate expertise that marries both the foreign affairs and the technology aspects of it. It'll help us to better define our policies, to better understand the issues. And I already mentioned this is one of the biggest challenges in my personal view, and one that will continue to require our collective effort. Thanks.
Terrific. I got a sense of what flag you're going to plant, but go ahead.
Do you? What?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to also say a couple of words about public-private partnerships, because it is something that, as Nino said, is, I think if you read the last 20 years conference reports, that will be in every report. The importance of the private and public sector working together on this issue. And it is true, but what is meaningful cooperation? I have yet to see an effective and partnership on equal footing where I would say I'm confident in selling this to other states. We have not found a solution to that problem. And I think another problem is how much states are actually interested. We're talking about a global problem, and a group of states very much focusing on the idea that private sector, that other sectors should be part of the solution. But then if you go the other direction, and they have no interest in that. So in a way, how do you reconcile these two approaches as well? I mean, you can keep in your region and promote that, but that's just half of the world in a way. So, so in a way, we're also facing a scenario where we have just fundamentally different starting points when it comes to this sort of cooperation, where one approach is very much state-driven. Security is state business. And yes, if we need a private sector, we call them if we need them. Or you have this very much this multi-stakeholder ideas, like this is a shared responsibility because it is a shared space. So, and I do not see that we are somehow getting closer to an answer of getting a global response to this and answering that question. So what we are left with, I think, at the moment, as is so much with cybersecurity, is that we need to really focus on the bare minimum. And I always, when I talk about the CBMs, I always say it's the maximum and minimum we can do at this very moment in time. I'm a realist. What they allow is that you bring together states with fundamentally different ideas and ideologies when it comes to cyber. And the bare minimum agreed on this. At the bare minimum, they agreed to talk before they escalate. At the bare minimum, they agreed to proactively engage in this process, leaving politics aside. It's tough, especially in the OSCE context. But they achieved that, and they're all interested in it, and you can build on that. But of course, all of this also depends on political will then to implement. And that is kind of leading me to the next point, the proliferation of the cyber debate. Cyber is a very attractive topic. How much is it helpful to proliferate this topic into more and more fora? Or should we just focus on what we have achieved, because these are good anchors we can hold on to? And I would say that we need to focus sometimes more about implementing and doing what we already achieved, because we have achieved quite a lot actually, and that despite all the chatter is sometimes overlooked. But of course there needs to be political will.
Fair enough. As someone who was involved with, in the Clinton administration, critical infrastructure protection analysis on cyber that came up with the notion of partnership, public-private partnership, 20 plus years later that we're still talking about the fundamentals of it, might suggest to you that we got it wrong and there needs to be a different model, but we'll hold on to that thought. And now, as promised, with 30 minutes, so let's do two at a time. We got 1 and 2, and then we'll come 1 and 2 here, okay?
Pardon?
And for those that weren't here yesterday, so we ask that you just introduce yourself by name, and if you could be precise with a question. I know it's always tough to not get a statement in there, but if minimal contextualization and straight to the question, and we'll get more in.
All right, thank you very much, panelists. My name is Patrick. I'm currently a student here at the Diplomatic Academy and one of the few Canadians here, so very nice to see that there's a Canadian on the panel as well. My question is actually related to kind of the policy side of it. I know that, Chelsea mentioned that she sees that one of the most kind of critical issues being on developing the policy. And my question really is not to kind of beat this dead horse of public-private partnerships, but I once had a famous professor that mentioned that once the U.S. cyber strategy was kind of selling kind of a blank slate to the industry, and that by that I mean just that by securing the cyber strategy, but also just cyber in general, basically the government basically gave them a blank check in the sense like, do what you need to do and we'll pay for it. My question really is that how around this question, really, how can governments work better with industry to come to a better kind of conclusion? Because on one side, industry really isn't willing to give up a lot of information like was mentioned, but also on the government side, I think that there is kind of some budgetary concerns as well, and probably a lack of understanding what maybe needs to be done. So if
Great.
Questions to anyone, but looking forward to your responses.
Hello, my name is. It's okay. My name is Siraj Duhan, NGO in Austria. I just have one question because I heard some almost all discussion about attacks from someone to states or someone to big industry, but how about attack on the human behavior? Who is responsible? I'll just give you a couple of words. US elections, Brexit, big data, and Professor Kosinski. I think now you can create a question and hopefully an answer. Sorry, it was understandable or not? May I repeat it again? Sorry, okay, sorry. I heard almost all discussion that attack is coming from someone to attack the nation or the state or big industry, but how about attack on the human behavior? Just a couple of words, US election, Brexit, big data, and Professor Kosinski, because I heard the big data is a big bomb. And how to, let's say so, create a system to save the human from those attacks.
Terrific. Thank you. So, let's public-private partnership. Why is it? What do we need to make it work? Since it doesn't seem to always be working, and the behavioral side of this. Just yesterday, one of the NATO officials, declared that NATO sees an attack on democratic electoral systems, right, as in fact possibly Article 5 level attack, right? But if you're not attacking you're attacking the voter. You're asking, right? How do we manage that from a cybersecurity standpoint? So, partnership and behavioral.
Well, maybe I start with a partnership. I think there that, in my opinion, there are two ways of how you can promote effective partnerships, and this is already two ways that are being tried, maybe not too successfully, but I do not see another way. This is either to incentivize, to basically give incentives to the private sector from the government to cooperate and to meaningfully cooperate, but then you need to give something back. So it's kind of a voluntary model of cooperation. And the other model is to legislate cooperation. And this is something we see more and more certainly when critical infrastructure are involved, since they are also national assets and very much responsible for national security. So I guess the former, the first, the incentivize is very much a US Anglo-Saxon approach to how to promote public-private partnerships, and I would say the legislation approach is probably more of a European approach. Both have their merits, both have their limitations. Again, I do not see what an alternative could be. It needs to also fit the market, so to say, in where it's happening. But certainly we need to build on these two models to get to a more effective partnership.
I want to just
add something.
Yeah,
Yep.
I just want to add to that, and I think Ben is right in terms of the models. But in order to make either of those two models work, you actually need to cooperate before. You need to communicate with both sides as you are drafting that legislation, as you are thinking about how to incentivize this cooperation. Because otherwise, IT is developing at a speed that is significantly faster than you can hope for any legislation to be drafted. So what you need to make sure is that when you draft legislation, it's not to have industry lobbyists coming into your ministry and tell you how to draft your legislation. That's not what it's about. But what it is about is to listen to the expert that then actually have to implement that legislation to make sure that, hey, that actually works, or this actually doesn't work, and here is why, and here's how we can make it work, by drafting it, not as specific as you have, but to maybe draft it in a way that it's still going to be valid 2-3 years from now. And I think that is really the way to go about this. And there are attempts at this happening. If you look at the NIS directive, if you look to Germany at the recent IT-Sicherheitsgesetz, IT Security Act, there are elements of this conversation that have happened before, and that have led to good results. But again, what I keep reiterating is we just need to be better at this. Both sides.
The security threat of big data analytics, the manipulation of that, who would like to take a stab at that? Chelsea?
Well, perhaps if I might just build on what the previous speaker was saying, just in the industry partnership idea, that when we decided to develop the NATO industry partnership, this was very much in collaboration with industry, and at the very beginning we had industry briefers come in precisely to help us to develop the policy as well. What works so that it's not just a piece of paper and, as you said, a nice press conference, but that it's actually, it's a two-way street. And for us, I think the biggest thing was in building trust, precisely as you said. So to have industry colleagues come in, brief allies, discuss what works, what doesn't work, and then for allies to take that on board when developing policy, and also to communicate their expectations as well, to have a real two-way street. In terms of the broader human dimension of it, I think we've all seen recent reports. I won't comment on specific cases or national incidents, but it is concerning, absolutely, and such interference is very problematic, which is why I think it's important that we all do more, and NATO is doing more to boost its resiliences nationally, its cyber defenses, so that we're aware of the issue and can have the proper information sharing and the proper dialogue in order to try to mitigate some of the risk.
Just as a quick aside, since it's an area that I'm actually researching in, I'll just comment, right? This is part of the broader conversation, right, that we have to have in terms of the threat development, right? We do not have very good metrics to distinguish between what's marketing, what's influence, and what's manipulation. And just to build on something that was talked about in the earlier talk about operating in legal context, right? Those three things, I can come up with a very good data analytic-driven marketing plan, a very good influence plan. When does it cross over into something that we would say that's not acceptable, right? Even though it's leveraging the same technical capacity. We haven't gotten into the public policy debate space on that, I think, effectively just yet. Roger, and then we have one over there, and then 3, 4, okay, with the beard.
Thank you. I haven't heard much about anticipating cyber attacks. There's a lot of emphasis on reacting. There's the whole notion of evidentiary concerns, attribution, proportional responses. I can get all that, but is there real thought being given to what adversaries like China and Russia may be actually thinking about going after? In the economic and financial warfighting domain, which has a shot at becoming the 6th domain of American warfighting, we think we can actually see cyber attacks that are likely to take place. Very quickly, Klaipėda, which is the floating LNG facility off of Lithuania that could make the Baltic states free. Romanian offshore drilling operations for reasons I mentioned. Select South Korean companies because of the THAAD deployment. Have we given thought to, for example, setting up cyber stings or being able to craft likely target lists of adversaries so that we can engage perhaps even in preemptive diplomacy? Are we at the point where we're doing this in a manner that mimics other military domains, that is planning, anticipation, and preemptive steps? I think we're there. I think it can be done. I was just curious how it's surfacing in your world.
Terrific. Yes.
Thank you, Ludmila Bogdana, a DA alumna. And cybersecurity is very important at the moment. And it will become even more important in the future. And the question is, what are your predictions? To what degree should citizens give up their right to privacy for the sake of national security? Thank you.
So the balance between privacy and security, right, as we move forward with this technology. Yes, sir.
Hi, name is Maximilian Mayhofer. I have a background in science and in the military. Given the fact that someone in the possible future will build a functional quantum computer, rendering encryption methods like RSA completely useless, and given the fact that this tech is only available to a small group of people, how will this affect the CBMs that you try to build? And please excuse this rather polemical formed question. Are we at the brink of a cold cyber war?
So one of the things that's challenging in this space is, suggests, right, it is constantly moving, right? But we have over the horizon, for those that are not necessarily familiar with the technical aspects of this, is the notion that we're going to make a major leap forward, right, with both computing capacity in the form of a new platform, quantum, right, as well as through machine learning and artificial intelligence. So that adds a complete other layer of complexity to your complex and uncertain world. So I'll ask you to address this. Why don't we take those three and then move to the next set? So we had this notion of anticipation, right? This goes to the CBMs, right? I mean, so do they capture sort of what we would expect states to start to do if this truly is an operational domain, as NATO has suggested it is?
Certainly, when it comes to anticipating cyber attacks, I think this is very much still, as much as I can see, a national exercise. This is something that each state will do on their own. This is going to be very unlikely to be shared in the international arena. What is being done is to get kind of clarity what targets are critical and what each and every state considers as critical targets and which should be off limits in a way. So in a way, what the CBMs are doing is ask participating states to come up with a national perspective of what they consider to be critical and off limits, so that we get some clarity, at least, what is acceptable and what is not. But in direct answer to your question, what is being done in terms of anticipating cyber attacks, well, this is very much a national exercise at the moment, certainly when it comes to the OSCE context. And I think it makes sense in that it probably is also focusing maybe on intelligence work. So this is something that states probably do not like to share as much, certainly not through the OSCE.
Yeah, just to add as well, would agree that this is in the purview of nation states to determine their policies for that. However, NATO as an organization, I mentioned our mandate's defensive, and it also focuses on resilience. So it's much better if these incidents don't take place in the first place, which is why information sharing is so critical. And in pooling the situational awareness and the information at 28, that's really helpful in having people be aware of what to look out for and then potentially how to respond. Would also, once again, reiterate the point about sharing with other international organizations such as the European Union, which we have taken great steps in the past years to have this real-time actionable information exchange precisely to help out states and organizations know a little bit more where to look and how to counter these threats.
Anything to add to that?
So coming to this anticipation of cyber attacks from China, Russia, I'm not sure if this is done outside nation states, so I can echo Ben at that point, but we discussed this in terms of the energy grid, of course, to say now that couldn't be longer a nation state thing if we have attack against an energy grid, which goes through all Europe's 37 countries or so. Yeah, so probably we have to find a way how to share information and how to get a threat landscape on this issue. Yeah? And most of the national arguments were, now we have certs. Yeah, but my position on certs is that they're very technical guys, typically. And what we need, in my opinion, is we need a link between the technical guys and intelligence services. And that is exactly what is not done, in my understanding, in a good way, so to get an effective protection of this infrastructure.
I mean, just one quick thing. The UK's new national cybersecurity strategies has a national cybersecurity center in which they've brought industry and CERT and these other critical actors together in one place to do the information sharing, but to engage in some of this anticipatory action. Balance of privacy and security. Or did you want to add?
I wanted to add
Microsoft is attacked every day, so
I wanted to add a few things. I mean, ultimately, you know, as for the balance between privacy, security, these are questions that need to be answered on a few different levels. Yeah, I was looking for you. First of all, countries are asking those questions, and they're answering them through their legislation. And again, different countries, different geopolitical contexts, different historical contexts are going to place the balance in different places. Number two, every individual using the technology today, tomorrow, is going to have to answer that question for themselves, not just in terms of the technology they buy, but also how they use it. You know, are you going to go out and encrypt your private emails, for example? You know, just using it as an example, which brings me, and there's no easy answer to this. I think this is an ongoing debate that's going to happen at various levels, at the state level through legislation, at the consumer level, at the state-on-state interaction level. It's going to be with us for a while. I don't have much to add right now to the encryption-specific question, other than to reiterate that and confirm that yes, that is a genuine, that is a, as you also said, that is a real issue that is coming. That, you know, a lot of countries, companies are investing a lot of resources into, you know, get ready for. So again, just stay tuned on what's going to happen there. I think this is legit. As for the question of are we on the brink of a cold cyber war, again, I'm not entirely sure how to answer it in these terms. But going back to what I said in the beginning, I think we have a situation where there is a certain and growing insecurity among states, where states are ramping up both their offensive and their defensive capabilities, and frankly, there is no end in sight here. And I think this is something that we all need to be aware of. And again, we'll have to see how that plays out. But in order to be ready for the inevitable conflicts that will occur among states down the line, because again, that's just what that's what traditionally tends to happen eventually. It's important to have these mechanisms to de-escalate in place before the shooting starts, whether you're shooting electronic bullets or real ones. You cannot start setting up a de-escalatory mechanism when shots are already being fired. You need to have this set up before, and I think that's why these conversations are so important between industry and the public sector. Why it's so important to have mechanisms like the OSCE, like the talks at the UNGG, to have military alliances like NATO, get their playbooks together ahead of time. That's why this is so crucial.
Can I collect 3 more? Is that okay?
We have a last third question.
Did you want to
The quantum computer one?
Yeah, go ahead.
So probably, yeah. Looking to the nuclear sector, so we have, in that case, we have a methodology on how to protect the nuclear plant, which is a methodology which is coming from the physical protection side and which looks to the threats and assign a responsibility party for how to protect us against the threats. That's more or less a methodology, and this methodology knows a maximum threat capability against which protection could be done, and threats should be ensured, and that works in the physical world. Yeah? So you're assuming that you know what is the maximum threat is coming to your facility. And it works in the physical world because a nation state can assume that, for example, leaving a military weapon out of this threat assessment, saying, okay, we are able to, so military weapons are controlled, we are able to detect a military weapon on our territory, and even if a military weapon is brought to a nuclear facility, we might have an army or armed forces which can defeat this. And I think about cyber. Yeah? So cyber weapons, military-grade cyber weapons are not controlled. Military or intelligence service is not able to detect them. And even if you would detect them and they are attacking your facility, you might not be able to defeat them. So that works different. And coming from that perspective, the question is, what is this maximum threat capability, and is there one? And my personal opinion on it, when I discussed this issue with nation states the last couple of years, my personal opinion is that the definition of what a nation state's strengths in the future is not longer defined by the question on what type of physical weapon you have. Of course, that is in some sense, but also in the question of what kind of logical weapons you have, or logical capabilities. So a nation state in the future might be classified or categorized as a secure nation state in terms of digital assets, when coming to the point to say, okay, we are able to, or we can ensure that our encryption is good enough, that we are able to detect military-grade attacks against our nation states. That will, in the future, be the element which is crucial for giving a nation state this kind of classification, to say we are secure against digital. And that is probably, especially this, it concerns me very much that only a very few nation states having the capability to say, yes, we are able to ensure this. Yeah? We can say, yeah, our encryption is good enough for the rest of the world. Yeah? And there are a couple, and I think most nation states in the world are not able to say that. Yeah? And I think that's a completely new challenge and a new perspective we have to focus on. What does that mean in the future?
Okay, terrific. Well, I've just gotten our signal to freeze us right here, but we're going to go into a break, I believe. Yeah? And I'd hope you would join me in continuing to engage with the expertise that you have up on the stage. But before that, just come with me to thank our four panelists who hopefully have given you a little bit more to chew on with regard to the challenges that we face in cyber. So thank you.
It must be stressed once more, cybersecurity or cyber insecurity is such an important issue, but still often underestimated by various actors in its importance. I believe, and I think I can say that on behalf of all of us, latest after this extraordinary panel, it is clear that cybersecurity will be high up on the agenda in future and also for the OSCE. Thank you so much for having been on our cybersecurity panel, although taking place early on a Saturday morning. I think you have deserved another round of applause for that. For those who haven't been with us yesterday and therefore don't know it, the coffee is made by the current Austrian barista champion, Michael Brehm. Also the filter coffee, so if you don't want to queue up too long, go for the filter coffee. We will start again with panel 6 on energy security at 12:15. Thank you.